Shalom, y'all. Welcome back. Another Wednesday night. Good night. A lot of things have happened. Interesting things have happened, and I'm going to go in a very different way than I've ever really gone before. So I'm stretching myself, but I want you to understand that I think it's time we talked about some of these things, and it's time that I learned about some of these things. And so, anyway, I started out a long time ago. Oh, before I get there, um, on Monday was the solar eclipse, but I'm not sure how many of you understood that on Monday evening was the beginning of the month of Nisan, the beginning of miracles. What that has to do with it, I'm not sure. Friends had suggested that maybe we're talking about the moon being a protection from what was going on, because since the solar eclipse, this is the year, middle of the 11th year, this is the year in which we're supposed to have greater numbers of solar eclipses, or not solar eclipses, but auroras, the shooting up of flames and those kinds of things. Now the word goes out of my head.
Flares, yeah.
Solar flares, which disrupt all of the communication. Since that's happened, and I've been watching for the last 3 days, solar flares are down. Literally, they're very few at all. So communications across the globe is working out very, very well. But anyway, it was thought that maybe the moon, which is Israel, something's going on and it's protecting us. And I'm praying that that's true. As we're going through this, I want to begin by talking about why I'm going this direction. For those of you who are with me during the book of Daniel, you know that I began to bring into understanding my understanding of the book of First Enoch and how it related. One of the things that I hoped you didn't hear was the fact that I would be a Messianic Christian or a Christian at all, because I'm really a B'nai Noach. I really believe in God. JC is not my way to anything. God is my way to. So I wanted to try to make that clear. But anyway, during the study of Watchers, I began to go back and look at angels, because remember in the book of Enoch, it talks about the fact that these angel-like beings came down and cohabited with, and then we ended up having giants or Nephilim. And then I talked to you about the different giants across the area that have developed, or stories from Asia or wherever have you. Well, that led me into an understanding, if the Watchers aren't one of the 7 or 10 groups of angels, what are they? And so I began to question, and I began to look. And the closest thing I can find in the scriptures or anywhere else led me to the idea of aliens. And so I began to think about, and I wanted to talk to you about what I've learned over the past few weeks that I've been studying this whole thing. But in our study, I want to go first off to the book of Job. So if you take your Bible, your Torah, Tanakh, and I want you to turn to Job chapter 38. And I'm going to give you the scriptures first, and then we'll go from there, because we'll go from that particular scripture, we'll go to Job 9. But right now, I just want to talk about, have us look at this one. I don't know how many of you know, I started teaching a class on Job, the book of Job. And so far I've got one recorded, and hopefully it'll get put up. But anyway, Job is a very interesting character. First off, people are not sure whether Job was real or not real. From what I understand, Job was very real. The author seemed to be Moses. Now, did Moses write this after he had written the Torah? Many believe that he wrote it prior to that this was one of his experiences, things that he understood, and then stories that were told to him, because in those first 40 years of his life, he lived in the palace. And according to Midrashic writings, Job, Jethro, and Balaam were the advisors to Pharaoh, which is interesting. But what was even more interesting to me as I began to look at some of the other Midrashic writings is the fact that they're all related. In fact, they all come through the family of Terah, Abraham's father. And by that, I mean they come through Nahor, as many of them do, because Nahor's wife, Milcah, was the woman who birthed the Gentile prophets. Sarah birthed the Jewish prophets, but Milcah birthed the others. Now, there's a lot of writing, and I want to read a small section, if you don't mind, from the book of Legends, or Legends of the Jews. And it goes this way: Balaam, Jethro, Job, and Eliphaz, who was a grandson of Esau, who would later become king of Teman, were all related. We read of Eliphaz in chapter 2 of Job, as well as in Genesis chapter 36, verse 11. Also interesting, in Genesis chapter 36, 32, we read of Bela, who was a ruler before Israel had its first king. But in the book of Numbers 22:5, Bela's name is also Balaam. And another coincidence occurs in Genesis 36:33, where we read about Jobab, who came from the land of Uz. Genesis 36:28, and Rashi would tell us that this is the brother, this sees in the name of the brother of Abraham, Nahor's eldest son was Uz. So we learn while we go through this that Jethro was a man with 7 names, and he goes through talking through those names. But when it's all said and done, all of these characters are related, which fascinated me, because now I'm beginning to look, when the Bible talks about characters, it's talking about old friends, people that have contact with one another. When I lived up in Indiana, we lived in I call it a large town, but it wasn't compared to where I'm living now. And people knew people. I can imagine in the book of Job and all of the others that these people knew each other, that they had relationships with one another. And so when they read the book of Job, they're reading about people they know. Now, in the book of Job, it begins in chapter 38, verse 31. Did you tie up the bond of Pleiades, or unbind the cords of Orion? Did you ever take out the constellations in their times, or lead Ursa together with her children? Did you know the laws of heaven? Did you place its rules upon the land? God did. But I looked at that and I said to myself, what's wrong with those names? Now, the first thing that came to mind is the fact that none of those were the names of the 12 signs of the zodiac. None of them were the familiar names that he should have used. But instead, he used these 3 names. So, being me, I Googled these 3 names. And lo and behold, it took me to pyramids. You see, there's a connection between the pyramid at Giza and these 3 constellations as we look at it, or groups of stars. Now, when we look at the Pleiades, they're called the 7 sisters. But in reality, there are actually 1,000 stars that make up those 7 sisters. And right now, if you'd look up in the night sky, you're only going to see 6 of the 7. So there's a little bit of understanding. But I began to look at the idea of why these 3 and what they had in common with the pyramids. But I want you to go back to the book of Job, and I want you to go back to the 9th chapter of the book of Job, and I want you to go to the 9th verse. Now, Job has been arguing with Bildad. Bildad, the book of Job is about why do bad things happen to good people. And Bildad had just come up with the conclusion that the problems that you're having are caused because of the fact of what you did and who you are. Well, Job would have none of that. So Job began by saying in the 9th chapter, in that 9th verse, if you go there, it begins by saying, um, who made Ursa Minor, Orion, and Pleiades, and the southern constellations? Who forms the great deeds that are beyond comprehension and beyond the number? It wasn't me. It was God. But again, he uses the same obscure, they're not really obscure, but they're not the ones I would have expected to see. And that's what drove me to the pyramids. So tonight, I want to talk to you about extraterrestrials, but I'm not going to really talk about them. I'm going to talk about something that must have been created, built, and it happened not 5,000 years ago, but more likely 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, before what we have today. You see, if it was happening within the last 6,000 years, Egypt, until approximately the last 4,500 years, were hunters and berry grabbers. They lived off of what they could get. And yet all of a sudden, they now are able to create pyramids. They're all of a sudden. Now the question then becomes, how all of a sudden could that happen? Or were the pyramids created before the Egyptians? And if they were created before the Egyptians, did the Egyptians have any understanding of what they were about? You know, I grew up in what I would call a normal Christian environment. And one of the things that came to me was the fact that I was always told that the pyramids were tombs for burying the pharaohs. Problem? None of the tombs have one pharaoh in it. In fact, there's no dead bodies in any of them. None. Well, that's strange. If they're supposed to be for that purpose, well, the answer really is no, they weren't. Not only that, we look at the pyramids in Egypt and think that that's all there are. But if you go to any continent, you will find pyramid-shaped buildings. Now, all of those pyramid-shaped buildings may not look exactly like the pyramids of Egypt, but they all have several things in common. One, if you were to look at them, you would find that all of them have one point that is pointed towards true north, not magnetic north, but true north. And at this point in time, they're basically a 16th of a degree off, almost negligible. But 12,000 years ago, they would have been on point. You see, the Earth's tilt and change of the axis has made it not so. So we have these pyramids all across the world, all facing true north, all of them. Now, if you go to the top of the Giza Plateau, where you'll find three of the pyramids, you'll find three different sizes. And the interesting thing is that two of them are set perfectly in line, and the third one is out of line. And you begin to ask yourself, okay, what's wrong? If we're really seeing everything pointed in the right direction, why doesn't it line up? And the answer is because that's not what it's really talking about. You see, the three pyramids actually form on Earth what is formed in the heavens, Orion's belt. And if you go from the pyramids and you skip there and you go to the heavens, you'll find that Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, all of them are in a direct line. Why does that happen? Are they pointing to something that is not earthly? Could it possibly be? So as I began to think about it, I had to go back and analyze what was going on, because it really began to bother me. Well, Most things bother me. But anyway, this is beside the point. So all of these things are happening in Giza, in Mexico, Peru, China, Turkey, Russia, Africa, across the globe. There are these objects. We know if we go to Easter Island in the South Pacific, you're going to see statues of skulls that don't seem to, well, they don't look like anybody I ever met. But at the same point in time, they're made out of stones that are so huge. Who could have lined them up? And what's the possibility that they were already lined up before they began to chisel their shapes? And yet they've been there so long, we really can't even see the chiseling shape. What's going on? So I want to talk to you a little bit about what I'm actually seeing. Because what we're talking about is something that happens as Genesis 1 tells us, that God separated the waters from below from the waters above. And so what we're going to talk about is that water in between, we call the ionosphere. We're going to talk about electricity. We're going to talk about energy. Because you see, if you were watching or listening, what you'll find out is that the pyramids are a giant generator. And that's where I'm going to go with this. Now, if it's a giant generator, there is no way that any of the Egyptians or any society that we could think of could ever create them. So they must have been here and somebody else put them there. And the question then becomes, who did? Now, there's another interesting point, the Sphinx. Now, the pyramids don't line up, but if we were talking 3,500 years ago, we'd find out that the Sphinx, which we call basically the woman with the lion's head, or the woman's head with the lion's body. And if you look at the woman's head, you'll find that it's not proportioned. Some people say that the head is eroded so much that they re-sculpted it to be the Virgo. But any way you look at it, if you were to look at that 13,000 years ago, you would find that Virgo, between its 2 feet, pointed directly towards, in the night sky, Leo the lion. So all of these things have some sort of constellation involved in them. There seems to be something that we are needing to understand about extraterrestrial. And so that's another point to which I was going. Now, the idea that the 3 stars of Orion's belt are a celestial, what do you want to call it, reflection of the 3 pyramids that are down below, well, you're a little late, because there's called the Orion correlation theory that expects us to understand that there is a relationship between what's happened here on Earth and what's happened in space. And it's gotten more and more publicity as time has gone on. Now, I want to give you some trivia. And I find this trivia fascinating for lots of reasons. But, again, I was told in college that the pyramids were for pharaohs, but there's no pharaoh in any of the pyramids. I was told that there are 4 sides on the pyramids, but actually there are 8 sides, because you see the pyramids in the middle of each side are slightly bent, creating, if you were above, you could actually see the 2 bends side together. Now, that's going to become important next week. If I get through this one, I want to talk to you about mirror writing and Michelangelo's mirror art, because you'll find it's very fascinating. But as we go through, that's as best I'm going to do at this point. So we actually have 8 sides to the pyramid and not 4. Did you know that when the stones were set, they were set within 1/16th of a degree of being level? 1/16th of a degree. How small is that? They were placed so close together that you could not slide a sheet of paper in between any of the bricks. Interesting. I also learned that the stones we see today are what's left of what the pyramids used to be. You see, the pyramids were made of two different kinds of limestone. What we look at now when we see the pyramids is the inner core limestone. That over the top of it, there was what's called Tura limestone. It's limestone that when placed in place, literally made the surface entirely flat and reflective. It would have been completely white for somebody to look at. An interesting thing. Oh, by the way, if you were going to bring the Tura stones there, understand they weigh between 1,500 and 50,000 pounds. Also, you have to understand that they had to bring them from Tura, 500 miles away. 500 miles. You imagine what it would take to move those stones? Now, they say they built the pyramids in 20 years. I could give you longer than that to get the stones there, let alone built into a pyramid. So something had to happen. Something did happen, but it's more extraterrestrial thought than it is physical human thought. Now they cut, they shaped, they fitted the stones together completely as they needed to be. But we also have to understand that today, what we actually are seeing is not the original pyramids. We're seeing the reduced, the deteriorated. Now, it's estimated that if you were going to count the blocks that are on the pyramid, the Giza pyramid today, you're going to find out that it has 2,300,000 blocks. The only problem is those blocks are weighing tons. Again, how do you move it a couple hundred feet into the air? They had no pulley system that would work there. They had no cranes. In fact, we have no cranes today that could do what they needed to be done. Something else had to occur. So you have all of these things. But let me tell you about the stones that are used inside. You see, all I've told you about is the outside stones. You see, inside, it's made out of rose granite. Now, rose granite is a one type of granite in which it is actually made up of quartz. You know what quartz are? Quartz crystals. You know what they create nice little shiny things, but they're also, well, you go to some shops to pay a lot of money for them. And the reason that you're buying them is because you're buying the frequency that they emit at all times. So imagine, if you will, that the walls inside and the whole inside is thick. In other words, it's not just exterior stone. It is interior stone. And into that stone is shafts that are created. Understand then that the shafts that are being created in the stone, well, they're only wide enough for a human body to get down a ladder's width. Now, once you get into the chambers that are inside the pyramid, they're much larger. Let me tell you about one specific place. It's called the King's Chamber. Inside the King's Chamber, there's what they call the sarcophagus, in which many of the people think that, well, that's where he was buried, but they stole the sarcophagus and took it out with them. Problem? The sarcophagus would not fit out through the ladder to get it up and out of the tape. It was built first, and the pyramid was built around it. Not only that, it was the size of the Ark of the Covenant without a lid. When everybody began to look at it, I'm going to tell you ahead of time that they have come to the conclusion that what you're looking at was where the battery that operated the generator was actually kept. Imagine that. Batteries. When was the chance that they would have made a battery as big as a chest? When would you find such a thing? So you have these bricks, you have these buildings that are together. Now, as you go through this, you begin to understand that this is a very complex process, precisely measured, fitted together so that it would never come apart, and built in such a way that it would become a generator. Well, what do you need in order to generate? And what are you generating? That becomes the next problems that you're going to begin running into. But in order to do that, we're going to have to look beyond just the chambers, just looking at the shafts that go down. In fact, the shaft's name is called Osiris, the Osiris shaft. To get into the pyramid, they found away from the pyramid, they found what's called Osiris's gate. You would walk into the pyramid and immediately go down. The walls on either side were your width of your body. You would go down into the shaft that was the width again of a ladder, into a room or rooms, depending on where you ended up, which floor of this you'd be in. By the time you're done, you're going to be down close to 350 feet. With all of the chambers, everything that you're looking at, you're going down, down, down. Now, you can find better information if you want to Google it or look on YouTube, because it's all over YouTube these days. But I want to save you a little bit of time and try to give you some understanding of what I've learned since I've gone there. So you have rose quartz, rose granite that has quartz crystals in it that actually resonates, constantly vibrates. So when you're going into this cave, this pyramid, there's a hum that's a natural order of what's going on. I don't know if you've ever been near a generator, but when you go near a generator, you hear this hum. And the closer you get to it, the louder it gets, but it's still a hum. That's what you'll be going down into seeing. So you go first into the king's chamber, where you find the sarcophagus. Now, you can also find across the walls different pictures, hieroglyphics, if you will, on the walls. There's also some scratched walls that have lightly plastered, and etched into them are other things. Some believe that they're just simply words. Some believe that they're pictures. Some believe, well, they just don't know what they are. You leave that chamber and you go deeper, and you end up in what's called the Queen's Chamber. Again, now you're going down another 95 feet from where you landed in the King's Chamber. Now here you're now in a place where what's going on is the resonance. This is where all the noise is going to come from. But you're going to see on the side of it a shaft, 4 inches by 8 inches on the side. And on the day of the spring equinox, if you look, or the winter equinox, if you look out through that shaft, guess what you see? Orion, Sirius, Ursa. So what is at the end of that line? What is there? Again, the Queen's Chamber has only been gotten into in the 1970s. For the longest time, the Egyptians wouldn't allow you to go near it or into it. But as they've gone on, they've begun to understand some things. But they still have rooms or chambers off of the King's Chamber, off of the Queen's Chamber, that nobody's gone into. Why? Because the Egyptians are afraid of what they might find. They might find out that they didn't actually create the pyramid. They may find information that is totally alien to them. They continue down. Now, as they're going down, we also find that there's a resonance, a sound that the pyramid actually makes. Oh, The pyramid actually makes a 7.83 hertz vibration. In other words, what we're saying is it vibrates at the same rate as our Earth vibrates. And if I were to listen to a musical note, it would be B flat, because that's the note that our Earth actually makes as it spins through its orbit. But if the generator were functioning, it would be 440 hertz, because it's actually creating electrical energy. Imagine that. It is now creating energy. Could you imagine a world, Nikola Tesla did, he imagined a world where there were no electrical wires. There was no need for wires, because you could actually communicate the energy from the power source to the bulb. Can you imagine how much you would be paying for electricity? Zero. Everything would be free. In fact, he begged J.P. Morgan for the money to do that. J.P. Morgan said, no way. I own the trains that move the supplies. I own the rubber that's made into the wire coating. I own the copper. I do. By the time he was finished with telephones and all of the other things, he said, you would have put me out of business. I would have been no richer than anybody else. Isn't that what the communists are trying to do? Make everybody equal? But in order to do that, you have to make some people poor. Tesla was going to make everybody equal, but nobody was going to be poor. I found that fascinating. Oh, by the way, how did Tesla come to these conclusions? Through the pyramids, and he spoke with aliens. That's what he wrote in his journal. He spoke with aliens. Now, Tesla had a book, 70 pages, with all the information on it. It was sold about 10 years ago for $3.5 million. 70 pages, $3.5 million. Bill Gates bought it. It's no longer going to be for sale. But that's beside the point. So we're looking at something that's going deep, deep, deep. So that in the Queen's chamber, then we had this piercing light that would go out. It was also built on the ceiling was a series of coils, or air between them. Three sides, they were smooth, the top was rough. They would vibrate, creating part of this energy that we're talking about. You continue to go down Osiris's shaft, down to the next level. Well, we can't go down to the next level. You see, the next level is in the water. I don't know if you knew this, but the pyramids are sitting over water. But not only the pyramids in Egypt, all the pyramids across the world are sitting on volumes of water, streaming water, flowing water. Now, they did samples of the water that's at the bottom of the third chamber. The water that was at the bottom of the third chamber, it's got salt in it, but not as much salt as if it came from the Mediterranean. And if it came from the Nile River is fresh water. So explain to me why the salt content is so different. Interesting fact. Over and over again, we come up with this new understanding of different things that are going on and different ways that we can look at things. As I'm going down through these lower levels, and again, the third level is 125 feet down. So you went through 98 feet, then you're 125 feet and you run into water. But the water is clear, kind of. I mean, there's some silt in it, but it's kind of clear. But when you go and look at it, you will see a lid. Some say it's on a sarcophagus. Some say it's just simply a lid at the bottom of this water. Now, they tried to pump it out a few years ago. In fact, they ran the pipe for down there, and they turned the machine on to drain the water for 4 years. 4 years of pumping the water out. Guess what? They never lowered the water. It remained the same all the way through. One person asked, oh, what's the lid for? What do you think it's there for? And he says, we don't know. And he says, well, why don't you know? He says, because we can't lift it up. It's too heavy. Okay, well, what do you think's underneath of it? Tesla said, it's a wormhole. You know what a wormhole is? It's a tunnel from one end of a particular place in space to another. Some think that that's how the builders of the pyramids actually got there, was through the wormhole. Now, I could be making this all up, but I'm not. According to Herodotus, ancient Egyptian priests spoke for a long-held tradition that creation of these underground chambers were done by the original builders, not Egyptians. They were called the original builders. And you can find also similar ones, not under a pyramid, in the city that was known as Memphis in Egypt. Now, these stories were confirmed when they found large cavities underneath not only Giza, and those cavities ran for miles away from the pyramids and connected with other pyramids across. You see, there's more than 3 pyramids in Egypt, but there's connections between all of them. It is an underground system, a tunnel system that's there. Now, if I were really a New Yorker, I would simply call it a subway system, but I'm not, so I'm not even going to go there. But again, there's water, plenty of water, deep underneath Egypt. Yet at the same point in time, it has a salt content. Makes no sense. Also, there are those who believe that this tomb actually in the first place was Osiris's tomb, and that's what would have been in that sarcophagus. Well, you and I both know Osiris was an Egyptian god. Do gods die? What could have possibly been Osiris like? 2 or 3 weeks from now, we'll get into understanding some of those things as we talk about the Sumerians and their role in this, and the Babylonians and their role in this, and the Canaanites and their role in this, because you see, they're all involved. It's amazing how many stories are in common between all the nations, and some of those stories seem to have made their way into the Bible. The story of Noah and the flood, it's in the Sumerian text. It's in a text across the world. China has the whole thing down pat. They even have a picture of the ark that they use as a kanji to look at. So you have this understanding of what's going on there. Now, as you go down deeper, you have this water, and the water was necessary in order to generate energy. Not that there wasn't energy already there, but the energy became increased as they went further down. And so they have this large body of water. I want to read a section that I found fascinating. It begins by saying, as the water moves through this underground cavity, sound waves are created. Do you hear that? Sound waves are created. Oh, by the way, if you go to Job 38:7, you get the idea that creation was sung into being. He goes on to say, as the waves move through the pyramid, these waves are magnified and the sound is converted into energy. Remember, God spoke the world into being. Everything then came from energy because God is energy. And so, as not to get too technical, it was in the Queen's chamber, deeper within the pyramid, the sound was converted. Acoustic engineers have determined that this area resonated at 440 hertz and naturally emits an F sharp chord. Now remember, the Earth emits a B flat chord. So we've actually changed the energy. Now, as it continues on, it says this new chord is said to resonate with the sound created by the Earth naturally. This sound was then sent through a small shaft 4 inches by 8 inches wide into the king's chamber, where it again pushed up through the set of beams that was an air gap between, and again, sound could be heard at 440 hertz. It makes the entire structure into a giant musical instrument. But it wasn't until 2018 did we learn that this sound could be transformed into electromagnetic energy. The sound moves up to the surface, generating electromagnetic energy. And in 2019, Eric Wilson published a paper called Large-Scale Acoustic Generators. What he determined was that when the large amounts of granite were vibrating, by the way, the 4 corners of the pyramid are on rollers. Why would they be on rollers? Because of earthquakes. The building itself naturally moves. The building actually makes sound whether there's an earthquake or not. And when you throw in the flow of the water beneath, you actually have a natural movement. Oh, you can't see it because it's so small. Have you ever gone to a tall building, like an Empire State Building or a Sears Tower or something similar to that? That building is always swaying in the breeze. But when you look up, you don't see that because of the rolls that the building is built on. That's technology that is now 20th century. How did they have it 12,000 years ago? He goes on and finally says, we can be certain from reading Genesis 1 that God spoke creation into being, but we read that as the universe appears to be sung into being, it immediately responds in kind. And when they were created, the morning stars sang together, and all the angels sang. So the angels and the morning stars are not the same. The angels are beings. But the stars, well, the morning stars are different. Okay. What we find here then predates civilization. You see, Christianity says that everything happened within the last 6,000 years. But when you begin to measure rock, when you begin to look at all of the things that happened, the dinosaurs, all of those other things, there had to be civilizations here before 6,000 years in order to explain rationally all that's going on. Oh, by the way, in the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid, in other words, you go up from the king's chamber into a shaft and up into the peak of the pyramid, you're going to find a boat. The boat is 153 feet long and 20 feet wide. Not a lot of water that high off the ground. What's the boat there for? Some of the glyphs show a civilization that came by boat. Could that be what we're talking about? It's just a possibility. So we have pyramids everywhere. We have glyphs that we have and we haven't understood. We have lots of things going on. We can find a thing called a water report, which showed high concentrations of sodium and chloride in the water. We can test all of these things. We can also, as we go along, find out that there may be a lake that's under each and every one of these that flows across rock, creating for us our stream, our natural water generator. One more thing I want to read. I'm going to, again, birdwalk. It says researchers Dr. Carmen Bolter and Klaus Donna are using space-age technology to penetrate what's called the Hawaii complex for underground anomalies. Now, this is in Egypt. What they found is mind-boggling. Multiple levels of huge chambers in what looked like a complex of either an underground city or perhaps an ancient storage bunker. It's possible this could be the depository of ancient and advanced knowledge of the Atlanteans. You see, the Atlanteans are another, we know about the city of Atlantis, right? Another possibility of what it is. Could these people have been Atlanteans? Well, anyway, they hid behind, in the event of a future global catastrophe, information in these chambers. But go back to the water. What's interesting about Lake Moeris and Hawaii is that it shows a massive network of tunnels underground waterways as well. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the pathways between the labyrinth of Hawartha and the Giza Plateau, miles apart. Miles apart. Imagine the technology for the tunnels. As we're going through, I finish with this final thoughts. Before the Pharaoh could face the trials of the 12 great halls, which are also buried there, he first had to secure passage in the form of a boat to move from tunnel through channels to the new chambers. All of this on his exodus from this world. Now, we've talked about Tesla, and I'll talk more about it next time. And I've kind of run through my notes quickly. So if you want a copy of my notes, I'm more than willing to send them to you. Just type in the name Steve Van Bruaene at gmail.com, and I'll be glad to send you a set of notes so that you can understand what I'm talking about. Subterranean cities, stars found through little holes in the pyramid, Orion, his belt. All of these things are coincidence on a natural order, but they're also beyond the natural. Something has to happen. Something did happen. It makes me begin to think that there are or were other civilizations before the ones that we're now living in. That before, we would also find that these civilizations were more advanced to create the pyramids, to create the things that we possibly couldn't do, because all we were in those early days, the days of Cain and Abel, was hunt and gather. Only later, after Cain had children, and his first child's name was Enoch, Hanok, to learn. Hanok had children, and the children began to live in a city because Cain built a city for his son. No longer were they out hunting and gathering, but they were beginning to enjoy the fruits of their labors, playing musical instruments. How could they go from hunting and gathering to all of a sudden have their own city? How did they do that? I don't know. Now, like I said, next week I want to talk about Michelangelo, because you see, he flows off of this whole idea, and it gives us a little bit more to think about. At this point, I'm sure I confused you enough, but I would like to be able to unconfuse you if you have a question that I can possibly answer and give you some straightforward understanding. But that's up to you. So I appreciate you listening to me. But again, if you have something to add, and I know Dave and Ross and I had been talking beforehand, and Lori too, and Rod. And so I'm pretty well discussed out. We're just plain disgusted. But besides that, let's just go ahead and if you have anything you want to talk about, anything you want to ask, even if it's not related to this, because I do bird walking myself. I find myself, well, in fact, in our group today, I brought up my stuff, and then all of a sudden we started bird walking into all kinds of things that I had no idea I was going to talk about. So the floor is open, and I shall be quiet.